Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm Jess Briggan, filling in as guest host for our usual host, Bill Fernikes. I'm a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs, from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and formal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Karen Robinson, Director of Human Rights Education at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights and creator of the Speak Truth to Power program. Karen Robinson has over 30 years of experience in human rights education, community and youth development, and community organizing. Prior to her directorship at RFKHR, Karen was the director of the Human Rights Education program at Amnesty International, where she served as chair of the International Human Rights Education Coordinating Committee for Amnesty International globally. Karen has also held roles at American University and the Close-Up Foundation, and has conducted numerous training and professional development sessions at educational conferences within school districts and at educational conferences around the world. In this episode, Karen discusses her journey into human rights education, her early career work at the Close-Up Foundation, American University, and Amnesty International. She then discusses challenges and successes of the human rights education movement, her time at the Man Up campaign, and her directorship at RFKHR, where she developed and currently runs the Speak Truth to Power program. Thank you so much for joining us today, Karen. So tell us about how you first became interested in human rights issues and subsequently in human rights education.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me. I love HRA USA, and I'm so happy to be a part of this podcast. So thank you for the invitation. Really growing up, I'm a birthright Quaker. So growing up, this idea of social justice and who I am in the world, my role in community, my responsibilities were just part of how I grew up. Understanding the Quaker testimonies of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship guided my early years. Not always explicitly, but just in Quaker meeting and our event, like it was just around me, and that's guided my life. And so, social justice, bearing witness, those were the words I had for it. That was my understanding. So my first true understanding of human rights was when I started at Amnesty International. Even studying at American University, like I was interested in these issues, these topics, but I didn't have the human rights language. I didn't have the understanding. I didn't have it. And hence probably why I really love human rights education, because once I had that language and that framework and that understanding, it was like light bulbs going off left and right. Like, this is where I have been investing my time. This is where my interest is. And all of that just evolved to human rights education. Because I really believe that there are so many people, and I see it every time I do work in the field, talking about work they're doing, talking about how they're teaching, in my personal life and things that I'm doing. And I'm like, you're doing human rights work. That's what it is. And so human rights education, I just kind of evolved naturally in my work at Amnesty International. And that's the space I believe in. It's the space I love. And I've committed myself to it, and I wouldn't really want to do any other work.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. And I relate to that so much. I remember the first class I took on human rights, and I thought, in human rights education specifically, I thought, this is a thing? There's a whole subject around this? Wow.
Yeah.
I get that. So you brought up a little bit about your time at American University. And so kind of building off of that, I know that you majored in law and society at American University, and then you went on to spend the next 9 years working at both the Close-Up Foundation as a program instructor and administrator, and then also back at American University as a coordinator for the Center for Volunteerism and Community Service, and then as a supervisor of the Office for Disabled Student Services. So how did these kind of formidable career experiences influence your approach to human rights education later on in your career?
I'm going to actually take a step back because my degree in law and society, I really thought I was going to be a lawyer. I was like, that's what I love. I thought that was my path. And shout out to American University and all universities that have co-ops or internships where you really get to, experience what the job may be. And I was actually in a pre-release center in Montgomery County working with folks who were like in the last 6 months of their sentence and getting ready to reintegrate into society. And, thinking from a lawyer perspective, how might I understand this, right? That's the type of law I thought I wanted to do. And it just hit me that is not at all. So many of these cases, I thought, if you'd only had this on the front end, like something was more preventative or proactive in your life, you might not have been in this situation. So I took this big switch to education. My father was an educator. I grew up around education in schools. I didn't really think that's what I wanted to do. But after that experience, there was no doubt. And so I actually started my master's in international education at American, but partway through got a different job, couldn't afford school, and just went full into the work. So that's kind of the back end of this. And so, when I think about how the work at Close Up and American University influenced my approach to human rights ed, I was a really young professional in these positions, for both of them, and got bumped up to management pretty quickly. And so trying to understand how to work with people, how to be a people manager. I learned some really hard lessons quickly about what that meant and how that relates to human rights education. I think anytime you're working in the field, there are these varying levels of management and people who have responsibility, and understanding how to navigate that and how to authentically talk to people at different spaces was something that I learned. But probably the most important was when I worked with American for the Center for Volunteerism and Community Service. We did a lot of work in DC, and I developed a deep understanding of what it means to work with community and in community, but with the community. For folks who know AU, it's in DC, but not really. It's kind of like at the very northwest corner. You're just about in Maryland. And so many of the people, particularly when I was there in the 80s, into the 90s, they didn't really look like a lot of the folks in DC and didn't really have the life experiences of the people in DC. So really learning from folks in DC public schools and other community organizations, being knocked down a peg or two occasionally, very humbling, but really important in my understanding of what this work really means and how do you learn from others and how do you be with others in authentic and honest ways, and recognizing that your good intentions alone are not enough, and good intentions can often be damaging. So really opening yourself to be uncomfortable sometimes and growing in that uncomfortable space, because you're better for it. I was better for it. I was better with my community. I was better at my work. And I think that's probably the deepest lesson. I can still see Connie Spinner from DC Public Schools because we did a lot of work in DC, and I can see her and I can hear her, and I still love her, just calling me out and being like, you're a nice white young lady up there from American University, but look at your community and listen to your community and be authentic and honest in your community. And she changed me. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson. And also working with students that had various challenges, just understanding who you're with and not assuming that just because I've read something or I know something or I have this or I have that I have the answer. Because often, as we all know, the answer comes from the community. It's there. Sometimes it's just the partnerships that help really build those. So those are probably my deepest lessons that connect to what human rights education is.
Right. And at the core of it, it's lifting up those other voices because they do probably have the answers to their community's issues, but they need that guidance maybe sometimes to help find a way to negotiate that.
Yeah.
Um, also, uh, just fun connection. My daughter also went to AU.
Ah,
Fun
okay.
connection. Yeah. So that is it is a great school and they have a great program and they immersed her also in that service orientation in the community right away. So I do
Well,
give
I hope she did what was then called the freshman service experience or the first. I helped start that.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Tell us more about that.
Well, that's where I really got to understand what service learning was all about. So initially, we started with the School of International Affairs with a woman by the name of Nanette Levinson, because she had this idea like, you know what, there's so many service placements in this city. Service learning was just really starting to come about. So this was probably early 90s, 91, early 90s. And so, yeah, so we just kind of put our hats together and sat down and developed this experience where first year students would come in. They would have mentors who were, older students. Students had been there. We would give them some pre-reading material. I still remember for the second year, we had them read something by Errol Gibbons because we had an environmental piece to it. But they would read a piece, we would have them do direct service, and every night there'd be a reflection component. I know it's evolved since then.
Yeah.
And after the first year was School of International Affairs, we set up with every school. So every school had their, and it was so cool. It was so cool. And, again, challenging students to think about um, doing direct service, not as an I'm doing for you, isn't this helpful, but recognizing that like collectively we're better when we think about this together and we are together. And then when we think about what are those root causes that are causing like having people homeless or unhoused and having people hungry or whatever the issue may be. That was really a cool experience. And again, just kind of really, yeah, put me on this path, and I didn't know what that path was until I started at Amnesty and had
Wow.
human rights language for it. So now one of the things that I really want to do, we're hoping to do this summer in New York City, is like a one-day human rights education service learning SDG workshop. One
Yeah.
of the last, I know I'm kind of jumping around, so
Okay.
sorry.
Go ahead. No.
One of the last things that I did at Amnesty International with Felisa Tibbetts and
Yeah.
HRPA was a human rights and service learning guide,
Okay.
where we built out for different subject areas or different issue areas how you could really create a service learning program around the environment, criminal justice. There are like 4 issues. So
Yeah.
I've kind of revamped that, revised, mapped in the SDGs, because I think, one of those small things that I mentioned later is, if we start to think about community engagement and community service, well, first, community service is community engagement. And then to understand, help our students understand that is advancing human rights, and most cases working on the sustainable development goals. And even bringing that language into this, man, if
Mhm.
I had that as a young person, what a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's true. And sometimes, as you've mentioned previously, it is like that language. I remember it was a course I took with Melissa that actually helped, gave me that human rights language and at TC Columbia. And I thought, oh, it's like a light bulb goes off. And
Mhm.
you do realize just how many spaces this is happening, but to sometimes name it gives it that concrete structure and like momentum.
Yeah.
So yes, and it's completely fine that we're jumping around because I know we had the amnesty thing coming up, but we can get deeper into it. But we're kind of dovetail into this now with this question because of course you've already mentioned how after American University you went to Amnesty, you became the deputy director and then acting director in this, Washington, D.C. area, and you eventually did move to New York as the director of human rights education. And you did hold that role from 1999 to 2008.
Mhm.
So when you think about, and because we've kind of been going through the timeline of your experience with human rights and human rights education, when you compare the field of human rights education today to where we're at now, and looking at all the things we were discussing kind of prior to this call about what's going on in the world and in the US context. But when you also look at that movement for human rights education today, to back when you kind of started working in it, maybe even, if we call that beginning that journey back at Amnesty in a way, what changes have you seen, and what are kind of the experiences and changes that have occurred, and where do you maybe see this going if you had any predictions for the future?
Absolutely. So when I first moved to New York and had the HRE role, I was so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I was like, this is awesome. This is so what I want to do. I had Paulo Freire under one arm, Pedagogy the Oppressed. I had something else under the other. I was so ready and so excited. And one of the first things, I was so fortunate to have what was then the Human Rights Education. It wasn't a steering committee then, but it was some of those longtime HRE activists who I name in a little bit, but with me, and so important to my journey. But the other thing I thought was, you know what? There are other organizations doing some work like this. So why don't we just all meet? Let's get together and let's see if we can figure out how we can support each other and do this work better. So I sent out, maybe naively, an invite to probably, I don't know, 30 organizations in New York City, kind of for a wide range. So this was probably 2000 maybe. And a few of the smaller showed up. The only big organization that showed up was GLSEN and Scott Hirschfeld, which I think a lot of people on this call know, who a lot of people on the call know was the director. And that was it.
Wow.
It was really disappointing, but also really eye-opening because, I'm not naive. I know that there's a lot of competition for resources and funding. And, I think that was part of it. But I think people were really protective of their space, right? This is what I do, and this is what I do, or at least this was my experience. And that collaborative nature really wasn't there. And that's what I was looking for, because I knew what we could do. And even at Amnesty, I was one staff person and with some interns. It was a small staff with volunteers. And so that was disappointing, but also, right, from everything we learned today, for a variety of reasons, that has changed pretty dramatically.
Wow.
And I just look at HRE USA,
Yeah.
right? And I think about that first meeting in Boston that I think Felisa and Nancy organized. Everybody was there, right? And there was a commitment, a recognition and commitment. And again, I think this was a culmination of a variety of different things where organizations recognized, we can't do it by ourselves, right? And we know that human rights education is important and it's needed, and we can't have a movement with you doing this and you doing this and us not working together. And so I think that was a key turning point, the creation of HRE USA, and that meeting was really incredible. I'm so appreciative to have been there and to have been part of the start of HRE USA. It was really cool. And I think that's probably the most dramatic change when you look at the groups and the organizations that are part of that and who are serving on the steering committee and volunteers like you. And that's a huge change. I mean, that's a movement, right? I think before we were doing human rights education, and now I think we are movement building.
Wow, that's powerful. So it was everybody was kind of siloed off in their own little organization. But yes, I do. I feel that with HRE USA too. There is this network building, and
Yeah.
I like how you put it.
Yeah. And I think people are open to trusting more. Maybe part of it was trust. Maybe it was because I was new. I don't know. I still will always remember Scott at that first meeting just being like, so I don't know, but I'm excited. I'm excited for the possibility for our work.
Oh, I love that. Okay, well, that's amazing. And that's I think, a theme that so far has come up in most of the things we've discussed is this idea of, even in community service, of it's about the collaboration and how we can do so much more together than siloed off in our own little corners. That's great. So thinking about then your kind of role as the director of human rights education program at Amnesty International. In addition to that, while you were in that role, you also served for 6 years as the chair of the International Human Rights Education Coordinating Committee for Amnesty International globally. That was a mouthful. And in this role, what did you learn about the successes and challenges of the global human rights education movement? First question. Second question, which I can repeat again, but is, what are the similarities and differences between how you see different regions, countries around the globe approach this movement of human rights education that we've been talking about versus the way you see that movement unfolding in the US?
Sure. So, actually, when I read this whole question, I started with the second part. So, I think in my experience, in my learning, every country, region, state, province, community has its own uniqueness, and whether that's cultural, political, their demographic makeup, right? So there's always something that's unique about the ultimate implementation of the work, right? So always, always. But what have recognized, and I recognized this early on in some of these meetings, that the similarity that we all shared in working in schools in particular, were the demands placed on school, and I don't care whether you're talking public, private, I don't care what kind of school, and the demands placed on the schools and the teachers on a playing field where the goalposts are constantly moving, right? Whether that's a policy change, whether it's a funding change, whether it's the EU focusing on this or this country focusing on this or conflict, right? Private schools and is my kid the best, right? The goalposts are changing. And I just felt like there was a consistency no matter where I went. Teachers in particular felt like, or in my experience, that you kind of get started and somebody changes it. Like they're asking me to do something else, or the funding hasn't really come through here. So how am I going to get to even the goal line? And so I felt like that was pretty consistent. And so kind of to that other part is to the global movement at the time, I feel like there was a real commitment. Like people wanted to work together. I think people came to the table recognizing, at least then, like Norway had everything, right? And oh my gosh, I'm blanking. I can see her face. Fabrika, I think was her name. And they just had everything, and they were doing brilliant work, but did it in a way that said, okay, like how do we then, like they were supporting other sections and structures, and people just wanted to learn from each other and borrow when it made sense and tweak where it made sense. And I thought that that commitment was there for me in a way that at that time necessarily wasn't in the US. I feel like people wanted the movement, wanted a global movement, wanted to be with each other to figure this out. Yeah, I can just remember times sharing resources and talking about like, how might this work here? Like, that's not going to work here for this reason, but this part would. And so collaborative, so energizing and exciting. The key challenge, though, always funding,
Yeah.
funding, and for organizations like Amnesty and others, really recognizing and elevating human rights education and recognizing it as important as litigation in advancing human rights.
Right.
I still feel that in many places, this idea of litigation and taking a case before here and taking this case here is looked at as more important than education.
Mm.
And I don't think that's the case. And I wish more organizations would elevate human rights education, the same level of research and the same level as litigation, and really recognizing that it's the whole of all of it is what we need to create long-term sustainable change and bend that arc of history in the right direction. Because litigation and research is reactive, and we need to be proactive if we want to really see deep change. So that was, I feel like, the challenge anywhere. But it was, those meetings were just so cool. And I still feel like I was young in my professional career at that time, and it was just amazing, amazing. And not that there wasn't a fire under me already, but anytime I was with those folks, yeah, I just knew I was in the right place for me.
Wow. Wow. So this is not one of our kind of pre-thought out questions, but I would love it. I know it might seem obvious, but I wonder if you could just expand more on the idea of why the education piece is just as important as the law piece, if not maybe more so, in like moving, as you said, like the arc of history in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would point to what we're seeing in the US right now, well, not just the US, everywhere, regarding student protest. And we can look at student protests throughout the years, right? Um, these are young people who are bright, well-informed, committed, passionate. Um, they understand what's going on, right? They're front end. And if we had more young people who saw the world through a human rights lens, the broad beauty, I mean, you talked about how great human rights touches every part of our life. And if people really understood that you can't silo economic rights from cultural rights or political rights from civil, and right, we can't silo them. If we understood that, if people understood that in an early age, and as they were engaging with others, really thought about how, so I feel like I'm jumping ahead to stuff, but really
Okay.
understood that they'll, like, every day you can do something, right, that is positively impactful in your community. It may not go down in some research report, or and I think if that idea of empathy and caring and understanding what that framework really means to our lived experiences, we would all start on a different path. So would
Yeah.
we still have to have litigation and problems? Of course, but you would have people that were more informed. You would have people in boardrooms who are more informed. And so when you say, why aren't there any Black, brown women on your board? That question might not seem so weird, right? Like, so if we had more in across disciplines, just that understanding that language, if more people had the chance to have those light bulb moments like we had, right? When we think about that happening in fifth grade, sixth grade, 10th grade, we would, the trajectory would be different. And so that's why I think it's more important. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I would actually agree with you being in education myself, but it doesn't seem like it's valued in that way that you and I know it should be,
Yeah.
but I do
Yeah.
agree.
Well, sadly, it's not just human rights education, right? It's education in
Yeah.
general. And that goes back to some of the challenges that I think we face, right? If you look in the US and what gets cut, who gets dragged over the coals when, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all the teacher's fault, or this isn't, yeah, it's education in general, um, which we need to change.
Agree. Yeah. Wow. And that's a whole nother podcast. Like,
Sorry.
that's a no, because I almost started just going right down that. I was like, okay,
Yeah.
separate podcast for me, but
Yeah.
that's true. That is a whole
Yeah.
nother thing. But you're right though. But it's not only is human rights education undervalued, but even just education, it's undervalued. So how is it possible that you can take this very niche little area of education and elevate in the way that it needs to be when the whole of education is not
Yeah.
lifted up where it should be right now? So there's work to do. Um, okay, so this kind of going into our next one here then.
Mhm.
So in 2008, when you had wrapped up your time in DC, I think at that point, you also co-founded the Man Up campaign and acted as managing director through 2010. So can you just tell us a little bit about this project, about the origins of it and your involvement in it and how it connects to HRE?
Sure. So during the end of my time at Amnesty, I met Jimmy Briggs,
Mhm.
who's he's just an awesome human being, and we were working on his book about child soldiers. So we created an educational guide for his book, and we just kind of stayed in touch because we just kind of knew that there was more work for us coming down the line. And I don't remember when it actually happened. I mean, we were definitely sitting in the Amnesty office, and he's like, I have this thought. And from that thought, we kind of ideation and brainstormed. And we were like, violence against women needs to stop. We need young people to lead this effort. what do young people really connect with? Well, young people love sports, they love art, they love technology. And so we kind of came up with this idea to host an international meeting of young people in South Africa during the World Cup. And it was pretty ambitious. Like in hindsight, I'm like, what were we thinking? Because initially it was like Jimmy and me. And then we brought on a team of folks who definitely helped, that had different experiences. I'm thinking of Amy Lay, I'm thinking of Patrick Phelan and Jessica Morris, and there are some other folks, who came in and were like, let's like really help frame this. And seeing this question, and maybe there was a bit of trauma because it was really intense. We ultimately hosted a 3-day summit in South Africa just before the World Cup started. I think we had 120 young people. Our initial idea was the first summit focused on North and South America, Africa, and one other region. And then we were going to host the next one in Brazil. But then there were some challenges. But this first one was spectacular. And we had artists, we had indigenous musicians, we had, Abigail Disney was part of kind of helping us think about all of this. And it was just amazing. And over the course of our time together, the young people would have a seminar and then talk about an issue. And then we would break out into our country teams and really think about, well, okay, what do I want to do in my country? And what does that look like? So some real solid organizing and action planning. And so for me, that's human rights education, right? You learn and you apply and put it into practice, and they have their peers to bounce the ideas off of from other countries. And it was really, really inspiring. And I think that the challenge was that, we dove into the deep end right away because we just knew we could pull it off, and probably needed to have a few more infrastructure pieces in place. But I'm still in touch with quite a few of those young people.
Wow.
They're still off doing some really cool work. But again, another lesson for myself in project management and organizational startup. But I wouldn't give it up for that time in South Africa. And just observing those young people as they kind of grew and transformed, and it was pretty cool.
Wow. Wow. I did not know that was an event that you had planned through that. That's amazing.
It was
I
insane.
love how in all of these stories about your journey, they usually involve, well, we just kind of thought we could do it. And so we planned it and we did it. And I don't know. We just went for it. But that's what's impressive about you.
Sometimes you just gotta, yeah.
Dive in.
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. And so the Man Up project, it's still running, right?
It's still running. I left soon after that because my work with RFK Human Rights started to kick in. I mean, Carrie had invited or asked me if I would work with them more. And so that started to ramp up. And when I kind of looked at kind of those realities of life, right? Do I put my wagon in a stable job or something that's not? I have 2 young kids, and that's just kind of reality sometimes, right? And I think we had a lot to clean up after the summit in South Africa. But I'm psyched, and I check in every once in a while and see how it's doing, and I like to see how Jimmy's doing. He's just a good person. So more good came out of them than not, and RFK Speak Truth to Power was there for me. So
maybe we should have Jimmy on a podcast episode.
I think you should.
Maybe he's going to get a call if he's listening to this. Be expecting one. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next episode continues our conversation with Karen Robinson, one of the world's leading experts on human rights education. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. That's www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Deezer, Player FM, and YouTube Music and SoundCloud. You can download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, please send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernakes, executive producer Christy Rodelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jess Briggan, and production coordinator Jasmine Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.